She resigned from the synod, calling on the Archbishop to resign. Thank you, Jayne, for joining us. I think that was last year on a separate issue that you called for his resignation. Just start by explaining why you did that almost 12 months ago.
Well, I resigned from the synod because of my concerns over the treatment of LGBT people under a theology that said unity at all costs, that the bishops had to work together and be silent often and not protect the vulnerable. And it's that unity of all costs we've seen over the last few days. You know, no bishop, apart from the very brave Bishop of Newcastle, speaking out and saying what the rest of the general public, Parliament, and frankly the Church have known, that the Archbishop needed to step down. And what we're seeing, I fear, or have seen over the year, is the abuse of power by those in power, and a really uncomfortable and unhealthy attitude to sex, which has caused so many problems in so many areas, and indeed this horrific abuse that has now come to light finally. You know, this report was available 5 years ago, and we have just sat on it, and that is absolutely unacceptable.
So that is really interesting, what you described as your conclusions a year ago, because that, you say, chimes exactly with what we are seeing playing out now.
Absolutely. I mean, there's two halves to this. One is the impact on vulnerable people of theologies or safeguarding issues where we should be prioritising individuals who are at risk of harm, and yet we don't for the sake of the church. So that's one issue. The other issue is to do with governance and power and our inability to break ranks and speak out when we know that abuse is happening. And I resigned because I felt the Archbishop was culpable in both those areas, but also all he seemed to do constantly was apologise and think that that was enough for us to then go, oh, OK, let's move on. That's exactly what he did on Friday. He just apologised and thought that was enough.
What is to stop, and sorry to interrupt you, what is to stop over the next few weeks and months to go through some sort of selection process, install a new Archbishop and do exactly what you've just described, with the key figures saying, let's just move on. We've had the apology, we've had the resignation, let's look forward.
Well, Matthew, you're so right. And that's why I agree with your previous speaker, Dr. Howes. This has to be a watershed moment for the church, for us to stop and reflect how we've got ourselves into such a mess. I think there are deep issues to do with structure, accountability, not just on safeguarding, but on holding bishops and archbishops to account. We don't have the checks and balances that we need in our system, in our synodical system, in our government system. We must look afresh at how we empower and allow leaders to speak out when they disagree, rather than muzzling them. And that's where the Bishop of Newcastle...
You think that's what's happened over the last few months, few years, few days?
Yes, of course. I mean, I've been in touch with many bishops trying to get them to say something. And, oh, Jayne, we need to work together and it needs to be unity. No, we need moral and courageous leadership, which is exactly what Bishop Helen Ann has modelled to us. You know, the Bible is very clear, if one wants to talk about one's Christian faith, about the need to do justly and, and act with mercy and love. But you have to stand up for justice. And when you just work as a pack and go silent, that silence is deafening, particularly to survivors like myself, to many others who've been through abuse. And we need to hear the clear and I suppose call for openness, transparency, honesty and accountability. And Matthew, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many other abuses that have been covered up, that have been left to one side for the good of the church. And I really hope that this is a time where everything can come into the light, where we can be honest about all our failings. And I hope, therefore, start to regain the trust and confidence of a public who, I think years ago, voted with their feet when it came to the Church of England.
it's not just the public. There are many, many, many victims with this case. How do you go about trying to actually have redress from all of those? Because they have gone through many years of this. They watched the Archbishop only last week saying he wasn't going to resign. How does the church move forward in terms of them?
Well, it has to be with action and not just words. We've had far too many words and hand-wringing. You know, we've been looking at how we deal with survivors of abuse and redress issues for years, and it's taking years for them to see justice done, i.e. Payments for help, for support, for mental health support, for actually redress for the harm that's been caused. And it's gone between lawyers now and insurance brokers, and it's treated in such in my mind, an ungodly way. We have to put literally our money where our mouth is. We've had speeches in synod about how money will never be an issue, but the survivors have never got to see it. And I really hope that we will start now putting survivors front and centre. You know, the last couple of years, we've tried, Archbishop Justin has talked about trying to drive through various reforms, and yet the board, the chair of the boards we put together, resigned in protest at the way the Archbishop's Council interacted with them over safeguarding. We must have an independent safeguarding group now who will take this away from the church and deal with it properly once and for all.
Jayne, we have to leave it there, but